Hello everyone, in this episode I am going to be talking about the weapons and armor during the Trojan War, among other things. But I guess let's get started with what was the basic alloy at the time used by weaponsmiths and soldiers. That would have been bronze, seeing how this is the late Bronze Age. Bronze is made up of mostly copper and about 10 to 12% tin. Now, copper was very plentiful back then. It was kind of all over the place. That's why the Egyptians and Mesopotamians were able to use it. But getting their hands on tin was another story. Tin was kind of spread out all over the place, usually nowhere near a copper deposit. And in fact, England was pretty famous for having a large tin deposit, and they sold it, and their tin ended up all over Europe. But the good thing about this tin trade was it kind of helped establish trade routes all over Europe and the Middle East, so that was kind of important for establishing trade routes that would continue to be used by later generations of mankind, so pretty important actually. But naturally, the reason why bronze is superior to just copper is the tin makes copper a lot harder and just better at making tools and armor and weapons with. Kind of like how copper was an improvement over stone and bones. So, just mankind progressing through technology and science. Now, when we are talking about the Trojan War, this is also almost the dawn of the Iron Age. So there would have been a few iron weapons around, but we're dealing with mostly bronze weapons here. Like basically every arrowhead, spear point, most of the swords and armor would have all been bronze. Maybe there were a couple of iron swords around, like in the video game Warriors Legends of Troy. They actually do a really, really good job of showing what kind of armor and weapons would have been around during the Trojan War. And a couple of the heroes, like Achilles especially, has this big iron sword, which probably would have been impossible at the time, but he could have had an iron sword, maybe just not one as large as the one in the game. But yeah, maybe there were a couple iron swords, but mostly everything's bronze. Bronze is a pretty good metal, though, for armor and stuff. But for swords, it's better than copper, but it's not iron, and it's sure as hell not steel. Now, not every soldier would have had a bronze sword. Naturally, swords are pretty complex to make and stuff. But I'm sure there were definitely a lot of swordsmen in the Greek and Trojan armies. Definitely the wealthier soldiers would have had them. Now, a bronze sword is going to be pretty light, pretty sharp, but once it gets dinging off of armor and skin and bone, it's going to lose that edge pretty fast. And basically, after the end of a couple of battles, it's probably going to look something like your car key. Just all kinds of dents in it, jagged edges too, so just eesh. So yeah, a freaking bronze sword clashing off of a helmet or a shield is going to be like, dang, frang! And it's going to be very, very loud. I can't imagine wearing a bronze helmet. Oof. Thing would have literally been like wearing a bell on top of your head. Even breathing would have been loud inside there. When I did my review of Warriors Legends of Troy, I wore my iron Corinthian helmet. Even with the iron helmet, it was loud as hell. Every time I said something, you just heard the vibrations go through the helmet, like, ring. It was just, loud as shit. So bronze would be a very loud metal to work with, but like I said earlier, very effective. And seeing how the Greeks and Trojans were both a seafaring people, one big advantage that bronze has over iron is it takes a hell of a lot longer to rust. If you had a iron sword or armor out in the sea, you would have to oil that thing all the time and take care of it, but with bronze will last a lot longer, so that's one big advantage there. And another problem, though, with bronze swords is they will snap on you. Even in the Iliad, think Menelaus breaks a sword on Paris's helmet. I mean, it just shatters in his hand. These are definitely killing weapons, but after a while they are a little more than bronze baseball bats. So, again, though, that shows us how brutal combat would have been at this time period. I mean, you're just hacking each other with these just rough weapons. Spears at this time would have definitely been the main weapon, though, much like later days with hoplites and stuff. But yeah, the spearheads ranged from just a couple of inches long to 2 feet long. I'm not really sure if they had butt caps on the other end of the spear, like they would later on, so that there would be another weight at the end of the spear to kind of counterbalance the spearhead's weight. But they would have been mainly a thrusting spear, which probably would not have differed too much from the later dory spear. That would have been the type of spear that like Leonidas would have used against the Persians about 800 years later. So they probably would have been about 6 to 8 feet long. Supposedly Achilles' spear was like really freaking long and heavy. He was like the only guy who could use the spear. And I think Hector supposedly had an 18-foot long spear, but I don't know. That's probably just bullshit. That would have been very unwieldy. But it also seems like there was, if you read the Iliad, there was a ton of spears being thrown, so guys probably packed a couple of spears with them. We're not sure if they would have been like javelins, but they could have just been like normal 6-foot long spears being thrown. In fact, if you read the Iliad, there's a hell of a lot more spears being thrown than arrows being loosed from bows. Like a lot of heroes are killed by throwing spears, but I guess so are a lot of heroes being killed by arrows too. So, But bows at this time would have been, it seems like, mostly made of composite materials like horn, sinew, and glue. So they would have been decent bows, probably on par with Egyptian bows. But seeing how archers didn't draw the bow string to their ears back then, they drew it to their chest for some weird reason. That definitely took some power and some oomph out of the arrow's impact. So arrows weren't the most effective weapon on the battlefield, but they were pretty good. Just ask Achilles and Paris. And of course there would have been some daggers being used, again mostly made out of bronze. Last ditch weapon basically. And it probably would have been more like used as a tool, for carving up your food and stuff. But also maybe slitting the throat of an enemy. Axes were definitely around and probably used a lot. Probably, maybe even more so than swords, seeing how axe heads are a lot easier to make than sword blades. But another effective weapon would have been rocks. You might be kind of surprised to hear that, but again, if you read the Iliad, rocks are being thrown kind of all the time. I mean, a lot of famous heroes just pick up rocks and throw them. In fact, Ajax picked up a big rock and almost killed Hector with it, so yeah, never underestimate the power of a freaking rock hitting you in the head. Now, as far as armor goes at this time period, doesn't really seem like there would have been a lot of solid metal helmets like the later Corinthian helmet and stuff, even though that's kind of the prototypical Greek helmet. That design hadn't been invented yet, so they mostly used helmets that were made out of leather strips and had boar tusk sewn into them, or some kind of bone. So that would have been probably a pretty loose and flexible helmet that would have offered some protection. I mean, I have no idea how strong a boar's tusk is, but if you're dealing with a kind of a blunt bronze sword, it'll probably protect you from that. Now, a solid thrust from a spear probably won't protect you from that, but it's better than nothing. Now, as always, body armor is extremely expensive. At this time period, probably the average soldier would have just worn a wool shirt or tunic or whatever, or probably just gone topless, But naturally, the heroes and princes and kings would have worn the best stuff they could get their hands on. Now, one example of some high-quality, like super heavy armor from the time period is called the Dendra armor, which is named after the village Dendra in Greece where the armor was unearthed. It's basically made of strips of bronze plates and tied together and stuff. Would have been extremely heavy, but very effective. Probably most weapons of the time could not pierce it. But definitely would have limited the mobility of the wearer. So it was probably used mainly on chariots and stuff. Because the guy's not going to walk around the battlefield with that. Usually he'll probably just hop on his chariot, ride to the thick of things, hop off, do some killing, hop back on, get the hell out of there. So it would have been pretty damn effective. And soldiers probably would have been armored with greaves and braces on their arms and stuff, but we don't know. The main shield of the time would have probably been the figure 8 shield. This was very popular with the Mycenaeans. It's made with, it's got the outer body is wood. Kind of like, looks like a bunch of, two bows put together. And on the inside, it's made with several layers of bull hide stitched to a wicker backing. This would have been pretty useful. Again, better than nothing. And some other shields would have been the Diphilon shield and the Boeotian shield. Now, Ajax was supposed to have just a gigantic shield. Would have, according to Homer, it had 7 layers of bull hide stitched together and outer layer of bronze. So this shield was ginormous, probably 1.5 inches thick, I would guess. Now, slings would be pretty popular later on in the Mediterranean, but Homer doesn't mention the sling, so maybe the sling wasn't really popular in Greece yet. Of course, David used the sling to kill Goliath, so the sling had definitely been around, but maybe it just hadn't made its way up the Mediterranean yet. Now, as far as vehicles go during this time period, Greece was never really known for its cavalry until the Macedonians showed up, so they definitely did not really have a cavalry arm at this time, but chariots were quite popular with Greek and Trojan armies. In fact, most heroes had their own chariots and their own horses. Now, the Greek chariot, as far as we can tell from pottery and art and stuff, the Greek chariot would not have been too different from the Egyptian chariot. It would have been drawn by 2 horses. The chariot would not have had really any suspension whatsoever, so it would have been a very bumpy ride. It would have carried 2 men, the driver and the soldier. And being the driver was very dangerous because, you don't have any protection really. In fact, many drivers were killed in the Iliad by guys throwing spears trying to kill the soldier on the chariot and missing and hitting the driver instead. So being a driver would have been very, very dangerous. But chariots were pretty useful. They weren't shock weapons like the Persians would turn them into and, adding like scythes to the wheels and stuff to chop guys up. They weren't like that. They were really just fast transportation. Basically, your chariot driver would drive you out to the battlefield, drop you off, and he would drive back to a safe distance, avoiding spears and arrows being launched at him. And then while you were fighting, he would just kind of sit there, and then when it was time for you to come back, he would come and get your ass out of there. It's kind of like a modern-day Huey helicopter, I guess. Now, the main warship of the Greek Navy would have been the Pentaconter, which would have been a single-deck ship with about 50 oars. So it would have carried probably at least 50 men. And some people have built reconstructions of the Pentaconter, and they've gotten a top speed of about 9 knots, which is about 10 miles per hour. So they would have been kind of fast, but of course that's at top speed. So Yeah, the Pentaconter, though, would have been a pretty decent warship for the time. Would have only had a single mast. It would have been a pretty good seafaring vessel for the time, but compared to later ships, not that great. Now, naturally, not every ship the Greeks attacked Troy with would have been a Pentaconter. Probably most of the other ones would have been transports and fishing vessels, merchantmen, basically every boat they could get their hands on. Because, like the saying goes, this is the war that launched 1,000 ships. But that also gives us a pretty good way to estimate how many Greek soldiers there were. So probably anywhere from 40 to 60,000. I think 50,000 is a pretty good benchmark to look at. So that's basically all the weapons and armor and vehicles used during the Trojan War. The Trojans basically used the same stuff, but they probably had a completely different artistic style. Their armor and weapons and vehicles would have had more of a Hittite influence to it and stuff, so would have looked similar, but they would have been quite different.